We begin in the mid-1600s with Nicholas Mahon. He was granted lands here at Strokestown for his services to Cromwell. He was given about 300 acres of land originally. He didn't build here, but his son John Mahon built a tower house in 1696, the first Mahon house on the site. Originally, the lands belonged to the O'Connor Row clan. They had been dispossessed early 1600s, everything given to the Mahons in the mid-1600s. The tower house, the 1696 tower house, is incorporated into Strokestown house that you see today. The house that you see today was built in 1740 by Thomas Mahon. Thomas Mahon was in the Irish Parliament at the time, and he hired the German architect Richard Cassels to design his country house. Cassels designed Leinster House, where the Irish government sit today, Carlton, Belvedere, Russborough. He was the fashionable architect of the time. And the house is typical castle style, a Palladian mansion with the two large wings on either side of the main building, giving the impression of a much larger house than it actually is. Early 1800s, the Act of Union was introduced into Ireland. For their vocal support of the Act of Union, the family here were granted a title. They became known as the Baron Hartlands of Strokestown. Very fancy name, very little power. Certain privileges, you could build yourself a fine town. The town of Strokestown that you see today was built by the first Baron Hartland with what they tell me is the widest street in Ireland. It's said that the Baron Hartland wanted his town to have a street that mimicked the Champs-Élysées in Paris or the Ringstrasse in Vienna. The title, the Baron Hartland title, lasted to 3 members of the family. The third Baron was a Morris Mahon. He became known as Poor Morris. Whether he was a spendthrift or what, we're not sure, but we know the estate was being run into debt. He was declared a lunatic, and on his death, the estate was given to his cousin, Major Dennis Mahon. Major Dennis Mahon is probably the most famous, or maybe infamous, owners of Strokestown Park. He inherited in 1845 a debt-ridden estate, many rent strikes, the beginning of the Great Irish Famine. What was he to do? Well, the first thing that happened was his daughter, Grace Catherine, married Henry Sanford Packen, relations of the Duke of Wellington. The combined lands went up to 30,000 acres at this point, and the name also changes to Pakenham Mahon. The next thing that happened was not so good. His agent, John Ross Mahon, advised him. We have the document in the Famine Museum here. He advised him emigration on an extensive scale, more or less clear your lands. Dennis took up this advice, and during the Great Irish Famine, mass eviction followed on this estate. At one point, he chartered famine ships, and he put a little over 1,400 of its tenants onto these ships, sending them to Quebec. Due to overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and the physical condition of the people getting onto the ships, by the time they arrived at the quarantine station on the island of Gros Isle, just outside of Quebec, less than 700 people had survived the journey. Shortly after this, November of 1847, Major Dennis Mahon was returning to his estate after a Board of Guardian meeting in Roscommon town. And just on the outskirts of his estate in the townland of Doherty, near 4 Mile House, he was assassinated. No member of the family lived here from 1847 up until 1890. An agent and some servants looked after the house. In 1890, Grace Catherine's son, Henry Pakenham Mahon, came back to live here, and it was Henry's daughter, Olive Pakenham Mahon, who sold the estate in 1979 to Jim Callery of the Westwood Garage. Strokestown House, it's quite unique in the way that it has been preserved. Groups and visitors are brought into the rooms through the house to see it as it was and really feel it. And when you go upstairs, I think what people notice it's quite unusual when you look at the house nowadays, the ladies' room and the gentleman's bedroom, they were either end of the hall. We're told for security reasons. Sometimes people ask, what do you mean, security reasons? And we go, well, we just leave it at that. But no, in reality, I suppose, there was always a danger of a raid on a house like this. The landlords were not the most loved people, and at least the family were spread out. The gentleman was at one end of the hall, the lady at the other end. and the children were up on the top floor out of sight altogether. And then when you look at some of the other rooms, upstairs in particular, we have the schoolroom. The children in this house were educated at home up until they were around 10 years old and then off to boarding school in England. And the room has been preserved with its original colours, the bright yellow and blue, believed to keep the children alert during lessons. We also have the original desks, and it's quite interesting when you see how the chair on the desk is fixed onto the desk, but slightly to one side to discourage the use of the left hand when writing. The left arm was slightly off the desk and it was more uncomfortable to use it. Writing with your left hand was frowned upon up until very, very recently. The Famine Museum really came about because of the archive, the documents. When these documents were found, in the beginning, when the house opened to the public first, the documents were on display in some of the rooms, in the library in particular, and in the gentleman's study. Everybody knew, and it was Luke Dodd was the first curator here, and Jim Callery the owner here, that something more substantial had to be done. And the Famine Museum was created in what were the old farm buildings or stable buildings adjoining the house here. 10 rooms dedicated to the Great Irish Famine, each covering a different topic. And the original documents are used in there to tell the story of the Great Irish Famine. We also have digitised documents. As well as commemorating the Great Irish Famine, we are also trying to do something else, and that's draw parallels with contemporary famine. We think it's very important that we remember that what happened in Ireland in the mid-1800s is still happening in the world today. People are still going without food. People are still starving in the world today. The walled garden here is quite substantial. It's a 6-acre walled garden. The whole thing was built in 1740 as one big fruit and vegetable garden. It was providing all of the crops for the house here. And I suppose when you think about it, it was providing for the family and their guests for their dinner party, but also the servants that were living in the house or in the servants' quarters were fed here as well. And in its heyday, there were 50 servants working in the house. So that's a lot of food. These gardens were amazing. They were producing so much. However, in about 1890, Henry Pakenham came to live here, very much interested in photography, science and horticulture, and he converted the main garden, which is 4-acre walled garden, into a pleasure garden for his family, putting in big herbaceous borders, croquet lawn, tennis lawn, and he moved all of productivity out into the slip garden, which is another 2-acre walled garden. The gardens have been fully restored. The pleasure garden opened in 1997 and the vegetable garden opened in 2000, so they're back as they were.